Hello and welcome. We are joined by Brian Shanahan, CEO and founder of INFORMITA and TermsCheck, and we'll be examining change management in working capital programs. And we're going to be looking at two aspects, one dealing with objections and how to build momentum in working capital programs. How do you approach this, Brian?
Well, Jack, I don't think it's necessarily how I approach it, but it's how my clients want to approach it, because I think many companies have been through working capital programs, which in the short term have been quite successful in some cases, but very few of them have actually lasted into the future in any great way. So more and more of my clients and prospective clients are talking to me about not just how you make changes happen in terms of year-end balance sheet, but how do we sustain that into the future so we don't have to go and do it all over again all the time.
And I hear that again and again. That's a serious problem. So we'll come back to that, I think. But if we look at dealing with objections, this is clearly a problem.
I mean, I had an interesting conversation with a Danish client quite a while ago, and we were talking about the whole subject of objections. And he said to me, listen, I'm fine with all the soft stuff, but let's make sure this translates into the numbers. And my message back was, if you don't deal with these objections properly, there won't be any numbers to talk about.
It really is emotional, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, particularly if you want sustained change, if I just want to have a result over the next 3 months, I can beat the hell out of people. And I'm sure lots of people will feel forced into doing something, but it's very unlikely that it's going to stick. So it's important that we understand, are people with us? Do they understand us? Very often, simply issuing the orders, is not enough, because feedback could be, listen, we could do this a slightly better way, or something like this. So sometimes, when we talk about, concerns and so on, it's not opposition necessarily. It's actually people trying to help us. So there's a very good reason for listening to all this stuff. And the other bit is that very often when people are making objections is because there is real anxiety there, because anyone who shows up to their job deliberately wanting to fail every day won't be there very long. So people have a real interest in not getting it wrong. Again, lots of this is emotional, but it's important that you kind of bring people with you and understand that you're going to do that before you start. Sure, we've all seen the presentations at some conference about you did your working capital program and it was all wild and wonderful and here's the numbers and it's amazing. But everyone goes through some kind of bumps in the road. So it's better to acknowledge that early, that you expect that, so that you can plan for it.
So that's really what you're talking about, and concerns are always valid and must be dealt with properly.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think what's also important is you see the last box here on the bottom right. It's almost inevitable that the internal organization will always perceive the change management challenge much higher than it really is. For example, I just did this just 3 weeks ago. We did a major change with payment runs with a particular client. Out of something like 4,500 suppliers, they had 2 queries. And they were very, very worried that this was going to go wrong. They had 2 queries, which were pretty minor in the end.
So what's this thing you're raising about objections can be symptom of a poor qualification or lack of experience? What does that mean?
Well, if you're proposing to do something, like for instance, I can go to a lot of procurement people and say, let's change payment terms with suppliers. Well, most of these guys, they've been targeted through their whole careers on price decreases, quality, product specifications, all that kind of stuff. This is new to them. And because it's new, very often they're afraid of it. So they won't say, I don't know how to do this, or I'm not confident that I know how to do this. You'll get an objection to cover that. And that's where you need to get beyond the objection sometimes to understand what's the real issue sitting behind this. So for instance, if it's an issue of, say, training, then training and coaching and so on can resolve that type of issue.
And that's another way of saying real objections are not barriers to change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also remember that I'll call them the command and control organizations. There are some out there who simply issue orders and the troops go marching off the cliff. They have a different change management challenge in that people will do things when they don't make sense. So it is actually important to have an avenue where real objections can be raised, because otherwise there's a potential that a real problem is there and you don't deal with it, and as a result you step on the landmine.
And obviously trying to solve the objections before they arise is what you're talking about in needing to map the decision management.
Well, you need to understand what your process is for dealing with these things. And that's all the way from simply listening, simply to understand what a problem might be, but also how to overcome a problem, which, you can take the softer approach sometimes of, yes, it's a training issue, or it's simply a matter of having the debate fully and then people understand. Sometimes still have a percentage of people that you go through all that and you still need to force them off the cliff. The first time someone goes paragliding off the top of a cliff, it's pretty scary, isn't it? So the instructor has to be able to tell them that, you're going to be okay. And then
you're never getting me anywhere near paragliding. Of these 6 types of objections, which is the most important?
My own opinion is, if you talk about concerns being valid and being dealt with properly, it's very easy to try and ignore objections simply because they don't fit your planned path, or they make life a little bit more complex than you wanted it to be. If you ignore these things, they'll just come back to get you later. They always do.
And that follows through to the next question, which is, who's in charge of such a program and dealing with these objections?
That's always a difficult one, because you have the people who are nominally in charge and the people who are really in charge. Well, particularly in decentralized organizations. So we'll have someone with a title, someone who's the program manager or director or whatever the case may be, or even a CEO, CFO. Yeah. So nominally, those people are in charge in terms of driving the change and sponsoring it and so on. But the reality is that there's a community of people to be dealt with, be it a company of 10 people or 10,000 people or 100,000 people. That there are many different versions of this kind of democracy going on, and it doesn't mean that it's a everyone's got a single right of vote and veto the whole time, but it does mean that there's a body of opinion that's flowing around the place, that if it's with you, it's much easier to deal with than if it's against you and you're continually battling against it. The final bit about that is, if you do end up in a situation where the majority of people are clearly against whatever the change is, very often, if you've already been through a concerted effort, it's probably telling you that you got something wrong.
Yeah, which is an important point, really, which to lead us to the next slide, which is, how do you build momentum?
Okay, well, I think the first thing, particularly around working capital programs, you got to set targets, and they got to be set from the top. The second part about this is there's no point having targets if you can't report on how we're progressing against those targets. Initially, the reporting will drive the questions of what are the things we need to do in order to reach the target, because everyone likes to reach a target. But you'll see I've made this point about transparency and self-management. And what I mean by transparency is that those targets have to seep right from the top, right to the bottom of the organization, because there's so many different people involved in very often such small ways that influence the result, that those people need to know what are the right things and the wrong things for me to do in order to influence that target. So, because I see this very often where people don't understand how to reach the target and they just give up.
So who should receive these reports, and what sort of reports should there be?
Well, I think many companies are still stuck in the trap that they have the high-level monthly report on working capital, which has all these numbers in it, and someone has to write a commentary on it, and that's probably about it. And there's very little in the way of anybody drilling into these things or really, really understanding what's behind them. I think what you see in more modern terms is people having reporting systems drill in to these numbers, so that we don't just see that the DSO is a particular number. We can understand who are the customers who are driving that. Is it overdues? Is it people taking discounts when they shouldn't be? Whatever the particular issues might be. And again, talk about the self-management bit, that then when people see that with customer X, hopefully if it's hitting the right person who manages customer X in a real way, then they will know how to deal with that in that specific situation with that specific customer. as an example. Same could be true on the supplier side or in inventory or whatever the case may be, but that they understand what is the practical action that they can take right now, in order to improve that situation.
So that really brings us to the close of those two slides in terms of dealing with objections, how to build momentum. But if you bring all this together, what's the overall opinion about what you do about these two aspects?
Well, I think two things is that if you, in most companies, if you think you're going to solve your working capital problem in 2 or 3 months, you're probably either extremely lucky or mistaken. There is the devil in the detail of this. And if you think about most large organizations, they have thousands of customers, thousands of suppliers, potentially thousands of products and production lines and all sorts of different things they're trying to manage. So there is a lot of complexity in organizations about how this is all done. So the devil is definitely in the detail. But as you said to me only 2 weeks ago, Jack, this all seems a bit boring sometimes, doesn't it? In terms of that level of detail you got to just continually wade through, and it's true, unfortunately.
And that's really the conclusion. My conclusion from working capital management programs is that boring detail gets the savings. Boring detail gets the attention to the right bits of the working capital management program. But why are they ignored so often?
Because they sometimes can be difficult. Imagine you're a treasurer. It's the easiest thing in the world to have a conversation with your main bank to say, how can I extend my overdraft facility or something along those lines? Literally within days, I could have an arrangement sorted out in some cases, but certainly maybe even only a few weeks. Whereas if you look at working capital management, even if you do it, heavy hitting and hard and quick, you're talking about 3 to 6 months. And if you're talking about the more sustainable issue or fashion of doing things, you're talking about longer than that. So it's not as quick, it's not as instant.
But it sure produces results. And that's probably a good note to finish on. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Jack.